And now, a special edition of Fast Forward, featuring an interview with science fiction grandmaster author Jack Williamson. This interview was originally prepared for the 2003 World Fantasy Convention held in Washington, D.C.
I'm Christopher Stasheff, speaking to you from the studios of KENW-TV on the campus of Eastern New Mexico University. I'm here to ask your questions of Dr. Jack Williamson, Professor Emeritus of English and one of the founding fathers of science fiction. What was it like submitting a story to a science fiction magazine in 1928?
Well, it was a wonderful thing to me. I was living on a hardscrabble farm in Roosevelt County, out of a unaccredited country high school with no money and no job, no future, nowhere to go, and I discovered amazing stories the year that Gunsback started it, with stories about travel in space, travel in time, new inventions, new worlds, and I was enormously excited with the ideas. Science fiction used to be called a literature of ideas, and we talked about a sense of wonder, and the wonder was in these ideas of travel in space, travel in time, and so forth, and all sorts of things that are commonplace and sometimes threatening now, but new and wonderful then, and any new idea was exciting. My first story, The Metal Man, was about an explorer who is exposed to uranium radiation and turns into metal, and any idea then was good for a story because it was new and wonderful. And now the ideas have all used up, and often they've turned out to have a steamy side. So the whole field has changed from the wonder it was in the beginning that appealed to kids and technicians, and now it's open to social science, philosophy. It's enormously diversified, and
Do you think that has made it more critically respectable?
it certainly has. In the early days, we lived in a sort of ghetto. We were scorned by the literary establishment. Critics from the Harper's looked at science fiction and said it was subliterate nonsense. And
Did you pay any attention to that? Did all of you want critical respectability back then, or did you think that didn't matter?
well, we maybe sort of dreamed about it or longed for it, but what mattered was science fiction and the ideas and getting into print. And the science fiction was a small community. When I started writing, there was one magazine. My first story was published before the term science fiction was invented. Hugo Gernsback called it science fiction, and there was a little group of us who sort of circled the wagons against the outside, and we knew each other. We could read our stories and comment on them, and it was
And there was a very free exchange of ideas, wasn't there? Nobody was worried about somebody stealing somebody else's ideas?
No, John Campbell used to give the same idea to everybody he knew, and said if they all wrote stories about them, they'd be different enough so he could publish them all.
Well, I think that was true. I think he proved that a few times. But for me, one of the prime examples is the Prime Directive, because you came up with it, but I've seen, 5 or 6 other authors use it, and now it's just sort of assumed that it's always there. What made you think of that?
Well, I was writing stories about robots. I called them humanoids, and I wanted a law for them to follow. Isaac Asimov had established what John Campbell called the 3 laws of robotics. I was writing at the same time, and Asimov's robots were sort of personifications of human reason. They were benign, but my robots sort of went off the track because they were a little too good, too benign, too zealous for human welfare, so they wouldn't let you drive a car, for example, lest you might crack it up.
Yep.
Wouldn't let a woman sew with a needle because she might stab herself. And
Anything can be taken to extremes.
right.
When I attended the banquet at the second World Fantasy Convention, there was a gentleman who had just walked in off the street and paid membership at the door, so he didn't have a reservation, and they seated him at our table. His name was Edmund Hamilton. I figured I really lucked out on that one. Did you and Edmund Hamilton ever discuss the nature of science fiction, or just talk about each other's stories, or did that come out to being the same thing?
Well, we talked endlessly. I don't remember what all. Of course, science fiction has changed since then. He was with the Standard magazines, Leo Margulies, and a very prolific writer and willing and able to write stories to fit a sort of standardized formula. He was the principal writer for a magazine called Captain Future, and
He was carrying the whole thing.
One of the contributors to the science fiction comics like Superman and so forth.
His spouse, Lee Brackett, is regarded as one of the pioneers in the field. Do you think her work was innovative, or was she trying to stick to the same formula that you've just described?
I think she was innovative in a way. She was one of the first women writers in the field who wrote as well as a man. She wrote wonderful sort of fantasy and atmospheric stories about adventures on Mars and other worlds, and she was certainly a better stylist, a better writer than Ed Hamilton, and I think they wrote better after they married than before. Ed was able to help her with story structure, I think, and she certainly improved his literary style and so forth.
Sounds like a wonderful relationship.
Yeah, very successful.
You've watched science fiction grow and change from pulp fiction to a serious vehicle for social criticism and artistic expression. But looking back on the 30s and the 40s, they were frequently called the golden age of science fiction. Do you think it was really all that golden in the perspective of what you've seen happen since?
Well, science fiction began sort of coached by pulp editors who wanted action stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end, with a male American hero who conquered desperate odds and won the girl of the pot of gold or whatever. And John Campbell was an editor who knew science and had a magnificent vision of a great human future, and was full of innovative ideas about the possibilities of change, of social evolution, of new technologies, and he was editor of a magazine, Astounding Stories, that he later named Analog, and his influence in the field, I think, that was led to what is called the Golden Age, and he cultivated such writers as Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein, who
were part of the group that circled the wagons.
yes.
What would you say is the current state of the science fiction and fantasy field?
Well, some people are worried about it because the big publishers are cutting back on publishing what they call mid-list titles, but I think it's still thriving. As I said, it's enormously diversified, and there are dozens, if not hundreds, of able writers who have followers of their own, and so you can pay your money and take your pick and find the sort of science fiction that you like, if you like science fiction at all.
Well, you still do. You're currently working on a novel called The Stonehenge Gate, if I understand it. Could you give us a little bit of an idea of what happens in that book?
Well, I'll try. I hope I won't be too enthusiastic. It came from a dream. I woke up with a sense of visiting a very strange place, and I tried before I was really awake to try to come up with something that would evoke the same sense of strangeness. And I thought of Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain in England, which is an ancient sort of mysterious construction, and it didn't quite do, but I thought of a penetration radar discovering a similar thing under the Sahara Desert in Africa, and went on from there. And my main characters are 4 instructors from Eastern who meet every Friday for poker and conversation, and one of them is a physicist at NASA who during the summers, and he comes back with pictures of this, and come the Christmas vacation they pool their money and go to Tunisia and go through the gate, which they find buried under the sands. And so what we have is, I think, an adventure story, space opera with no spaceships, a study of slavery, a look at slavery, and a look at the possibilities of high technology, and finally a meditation on death. And I don't know whether anybody else will find that in the story or not. Every reader reads a different story, but that's what it is to me. I didn't plan it in advance. It just grew from one chapter to the next, but I'm at the moment near the end of it and very happy myself with the way it's grown.
Sometimes the story takes control of the writer, huh?
Which is good.
Yeah. I've had that
The story's
happen.
smarter than you are.
Yes.
It makes its own laws.
As I've read your work over the years, and I have been reading your work for years,
Thank you.
and I've been impressed with the increasing depth in it. How would you say your writing has changed?
Well, what I write comes from my concerns, interests at the time, and I don't keep a diary or a journal or make notes. What I write comes from what I am at the time, and I've changed myself and growing from 20 years old to 95, so when I try to go back to, once tried to go back to writing a new novel about the Legionnaires of Space, well, it was very difficult to try to get back into the person who wrote the stories in the first place.
Yeah.
I'm just a different person.
And over the course of your career, you have worked with, what, a dozen different editors, 20?
well, a good many different editors, beginning with Hugo Gernsback and F. Orland, Tremaine, John Campbell, and
You obviously developed professional relationships with
yes,
some of them.
I've got along well with editors and have been grateful for the assistance they've given me. John Campbell was prolific with ideas, and
I understand that he had some limitations on what he would accept from writers, though.
well, I never had any difficulty with him, but for example, Heinlein wanted to treat sex in his stories in a way that Campbell didn't approve of. He had an assistant or secretary named Kay Tarrant who was very careful to keep anything off color out of this magazine.
And then, after reading Stranger in a Strange Land, I think I can understand why she was so careful.
Dr. Williamson, is the distinction between fantasy and science fiction artificial? Do they naturally merge into one another, do you think? I know that many writers write both.
Well, to me, they're both fantasy. The difference is in the reader's mind, if he believes that the events could happen somewhere, sometime, somehow, it can be science fiction. If you have to make a long jump of the imagination, like Alice in Wonderland, for example, why, it's fantasy. But when you get the story going, when you're interested in the characters and the problem and the theme, well, it doesn't really matter. And I like to minimize the difference, but some readers will read fantasy and some won't science fiction, and I'm grateful for the diversity of opinion.
Well, I think a really good example of that is Fred Pohl's Gateway series, because it almost seems like magic when you're dealing with artifacts from another culture. Did you and Pohl ever discuss this distinction, or?
Not that I remember, but Fred is an old friend of mine. I met him at the First World Convention in 1939. He was a Futurian. The Futurians were locked out of the convention because they were a little too liberal in political opinions, and I visited with them in Automata across the street from the convention, and Fred's been my friend ever since. We've written 10 novels in collaboration. If he's at the convention, I'd like to give him my warmest personal greetings.
What was it like collaborating with Pohl?
Well, I admire admire him in many ways. He's been not only a collaborator, but my friend, a fellow army weatherman, my editor, and so forth. And generally in working together, we discussed the story idea, and I wrote the first draft, and he did the finished copy, and I made a point not to quibble with him about anything he did to it, and he always improved the story enormously. It didn't always work exactly that way, but that was the general theory.
Did you ever work with him as an editor? Were you?
Well, he bought novels of mine when he was editor of Pocket Books. He bought stories of mine when he was editor at Galaxy and Worlds of If and so forth.
So in addition to a friendly relationship, you also had, what, 2 different professional relationships, at least? And when you are writing today,
Does any of the working methods that you developed over the years still apply, or have you changed your working methods completely?
Well, I'm not fully aware of all the changes I've made. When I'm involved in a story, why it makes its own laws, it shapes itself. I'm not worried about methods at all. These skills become automatic or unconscious or whatever.
I understand.
Aware of the rules of technique. I've been teaching science fiction and creative writing with Dr. Caldwell for many years, and I try to do in my stories what I try to tell students to do.
I understand that while you were, well, I shouldn't say I understand. I have heard rumors that while you were teaching here full time, you were writing less.
That's certainly true. Writing, well, let's say that getting my degrees and learning to teach and teaching and exploring good literature and so forth was pretty much a full-time occupation for many years, and it was thanks to collaboration with such people as Fred Powell and Jim Gunn that I was able to keep alive in the field.
Do you think that the whole experience of delving deeply into literature for your doctorate and then teaching it changed your writing?
I'm sure it did. I'm not sure just exactly how, but you become more aware of character and forces in history and technology, and generally the world changes. What you write is part of the temper and philosophy and so forth at the time you're writing. As culture changes, why, if you're part of it, you change in what you write and have to say yourself. I like to say that writing is sort of like joining a conversation, and you need to know what other people are saying and to understand the topics and have something you feel is worth contributing.
Well, you certainly have had an immense amount to contribute over the years.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you deeply.
When I first came to this campus, you and Dr. Caldwell were very gracious in inviting me to join you at the Wednesday morning writers meeting in El Rancho restaurant. And I've been wondering when that custom originated and how long has it been going on?
Well, it's probably a dozen years. I don't know. There were a couple of women in town I knew who were writing romance novels, and I guess I invited one of them to lunch, and we invited other people, and it sort of has gone on from there. The people attending have changed a little bit, but it's still something I enjoy and look forward to.
Have you been able to get any ideas from stories from those sessions?
No, I don't think so. We don't talk about writing. We talk about New Mexico politics or anything else.
Yes, I've noticed if you get a couple of PhDs together, they usually talk about their children.
Yeah.
I understand you've just had another short story published, A Man from Somewhere. Could you tell the people in Washington a little about that?
Well, that appeared in Asimov's magazine. It's a novelette. Originally it was called The Baby Black Hole, and it's a story about a scientist who discovers microscopic black holes in the cosmic radiation, and he captures one of them and feeds it electrons and grows it a little bigger, and it cuts away and falls to the center of the earth, and it's gradually eating up the earth, and the main character in the story is the discovers the danger, tries to stop the experimenter, and causes an accident that releases it. So in the story, he's responsible for the destruction of the earth. And the story became too long and involved, so I had this man suffer amnesia, and the narrator is a doctor, and as the story begins, where a naked man holding a piece of cardboard to hide his privates is walking up the street, and he's the man who caused the disaster and came back in time to try to stop it and failed. So the action of the story takes place in a few days as the doctor enables the man to recover his lost memory, and I was happy with the story, the way the story came out.
I'm fascinated at why you thought the story was running too long, but I don't have time to follow that up right now, I'm afraid. We are just about out of time, so would you have a last few words to tell the people in Washington?
Only that I wish I could be there, and I hope they have a great convention, as I'm sure they will.
I will echo those sentiments. Thank you very much, Dr. Williamson, for sharing so much of your career and insights. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I'm certainly looking forward to the next one.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.